Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment in the Georgetown University Wargaming Society webinar series. It's my pleasure to welcome for you Mark Jones, who will be talking about communicating uncertainty in wargames. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our speaker to introduce himself. Mark, you're at the mic.
Thank you, Nick. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Jones. I describe myself as a husband, grandfather, experimental test pilot, and Air Force colonel. Professionally, I've been part of the wargaming community since 2016 when I served at the Pentagon in the Wargaming Strategy Division, but I've been playing war games as an Air Force officer and as a cadet before that since 1995. Currently, one of the things that is in my Special Operations Air Power portfolio at the headquarters of Air Force Special Operations Command is wargaming initiatives for the Operations Directorate. Normally, war games go in a strategy or a plans directorate, but we do have some initiatives that are focused on the Operations Directorate. Because I am a member of the Armed Forces, obviously I have to give you the standard disclaimer, which you can see here on the screen. The opinions expressed here in our mind and do not reflect the official position of the Air Force Special Operations Command, the U.S. Air Force Reserve, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Another consequence of the fact that I'm an Air Force officer is that because I work in a SCIF, the audio controls on the computer are locked down pretty tightly, so I don't have a camera. There will be a picture of me at the end of the display. I will have the chat box up, so please feel free to ask questions or answer questions that I ask you during the presentation. So the first thing I want to do tonight is take you on a journey to Hawaii, beautiful Hawaii. I want you to imagine the crystal water, the blue sky, and the warm breeze. Imagine yourself sitting in Honolulu, Hawaii. The birds are chirping and the breeze rustles the palm branches. But in the background, another sound starts to appear. It seems out of place even as it grows louder. Suddenly, the skies are full of Japanese aircraft, and the chaos announces the attack on naval forces in Pearl Harbor and all over the island of Oahu. This was probably the scene observed by Rear Admiral Harry Yarnell. Now, if that name surprises you, I'm glad. Admiral Yarnell actually conducted a large-scale war game in 1932, together with a large-scale exercise designed to test the vulnerability of the fleet stationed there. I was left wondering, history leaves us wondering, if Yarnell first saw this idea during a tabletop war game, and it is certainly a reasonable assumption. If such a tabletop war game, if such a large-scale exercise together accurately predicted the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, why was the United States unprepared? On December 7th, 9 years later. I believe that understanding war games and the nature of their outcomes may provide a clue. There are two other historical vignettes that I think kind of tell the same story. Most of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the war games played by the Japanese fleet, by the Japanese Navy, while they were underway towards Midway. In fact, one of the iterations of the war game perfectly predicted what the U.S. fleet would do. And that outcome was unbelievable to the flag officers who had set up the war game, so it was kind of swept under the rug. It was adjudicated and explained away. That's another classic example of war games perfectly predicting the future. The final example I want to share is Desert Storm. In the lead up to Desert Storm in 1990, analysts used war games extensively. Matt Caffrey, who used to work at the Pentagon, used to teach a lot about war games and has also written a book. He says this in his book: the impact of wargaming on the Gulf War was enormous and mostly positive. Yet, coalition casualty indications were over 20 times too high. These indications had real political and military consequences. One of the consequences was that the Bush administration used the casualty estimates to shape many of their logistical decisions. I wonder if any single leader stopped to ask how much confidence they had in the estimate of the casualties. If they did ask, how could we have missed the mark so grossly? Here's an example now where Wargames didn't perfectly predict the future. Caffrey asked a similar question about confidence and about these estimates and attempts to explain why in a tactical wargame. This is what he says. Contemporary computerized wargames did not include code that would have units involuntarily change their posture. In other words, the computer would not let the unit stop attacking, retreat, or melt away based on the number of casualties suffered and other factors. Therefore, multiple wargames depicted Iraqi units fighting and inflicting casualties to the last man. As a result, high casualty estimates on the coalition side, C-130 transport aircraft were configured for medical airlift instead of being configured to fly in fuel that was actually needed. So, since the U.S. wargames had a unique asterisk in their code, they would not let the Iraqis retreat. There was also little preparation for the large number of POWs that were actually encountered in that war. This particular anecdote is in Matt Caffrey's book on wargaming, which is a book that I recommend. But he describes the use of wargames widely from the tactical wargame to the most strategic. And at each of these levels, he explains that leaders down at the low level, like a company commander, up to the President of the United States, use outcome of wargames to support their decisions. But the conclusions drawn from these wargames vary as widely as their level of use. So how do we make sense out of wargames and their outcomes? I believe that there is an elementary tool that I'm going to call the 3Q. I believe that this elementary tool provides kind of a checklist for helping us think through the estimates provided by these wargames. You can see the agenda here tonight. It won't take long for me to explain the 3Q. It will, however, take a long time for us to explore all of the dead ends, pitfalls, and reversals in the maze of the 3Q. I hope that you find a surprise around every corner. I believe that you will. So let's define the 3Q. The first step, I believe, when we consider wargame outcomes is that we should define the outcome both qualitatively and quantitatively. I'll quick define these 3Q, and then we'll go through a short illustration to kind of explain what we mean. All right, so step one is define the outcomes qualitatively and quantitatively. Step two is define the range of possible outcomes. And then step three is to define the frequency of possible outcomes. You'll note that only in step one do I specify the qualitative and the quantitative, but you can, in steps 2 and 3, also look at it from both a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. All right, let me illustrate. Let's talk about football. In 2024, San Francisco played the Kansas City Chiefs in the Super Bowl. Does anybody remember who won the game? If you want to type your answer in the chat, I'll answer that. The Chiefs. All right. That is correct. All right. So what we have just done is define the outcome of the Super Bowl qualitatively. The Chiefs won the game. But if we define the outcome of the game quantitatively as well, I believe it sheds a little bit more light on what actually happened in the game. Does anybody remember the score? I don't. I remember in the first half it was very close. And in the second half, I think the Chiefs pulled ahead by 1, maybe 2 touchdowns. So I'm just going to, for the sake of estimation, say that the score was 28-20 final. Now I have just defined the outcome of the game quantitatively. Understanding that the Chiefs won by a score of 28-20 tells you something about the game. So let's look at step 2 of the 3Q. Define the range of possible outcomes. I don't know what the worst blowout in Super Bowl history was, but if I had told you that the Chiefs won the game by a score of 42-0, you would have been surprised that the other team didn't seem to show up for the championship game. If I had told you that the score was 3-7, you would have pictured a defensive game with a lot of plays, very little yardage, and multiple possessions. The range of possible outcomes on a football game is actually much wider than that. Again, I'm going to ask you a couple questions. Please feel free to post your answer in the chat. So what is the theoretical minimum score of a football game? Let's just say, yep, 0-0. A theoretical minimum of 0-0. I think the rule books don't allow a tie, but theoretically we can do no worse than 0-0. So one side, the left hand of the range of possible outcomes, is a 0-0 tie. What's the upper bound theoretically possible in a football game? Anybody have any guesses? Do you think 70 points in one game is a theoretical upper bound? Do you think it would be possible to score 120 points in one game? These are all excellent questions, and we could do one of two things. We could go into history and look for an example to kind of inform our estimate of the top of the range, or we could do some quick mental math. So let's just say that the Chiefs kicked off the football. The San Francisco 49ers received. They immediately fumbled. The Chiefs pick it up and run it into the end zone for 6 points, and they kick the extra point for 7. Let's say that took 10 seconds. Chiefs get the ball. The Chiefs set up for another kick. They kick off. The same thing happens. The San Francisco 49ers are just not having a good night. Theoretically, then, if we estimate it in this way, we can end up with a score of something like 180-0. But the simple fact is that asking the question, what is the theoretical upper bound of a football game, forced us to examine our own assumptions about how to think about the problem. Are we going to think about the problem purely from a historical perspective? Are we going to think about it purely from a mathematical perspective? And then it forces us to kind of write down or say out loud our assumptions. So if I write this down, this is how I'm computing this number, 180-0, then when someone else comes back to look at our analysis, they will understand what thought process we went through. So theoretically speaking, the range of possible scores goes from a 0-0 tie on one end to a 180-0 blowout on the other end. Now, is it possible that on one of these kickoffs, the Chiefs ran it back in 7 seconds and actually scored 187? Yes, it is. But is there any real practical difference between 180 points and 187 points? No, not really. And I think we all understand that because we can apply our judgment to the problem. All right, so that's the first 2 steps of the 3Q. The third step is a little bit more difficult. Examine the frequency of possible outcomes. So we'll start on the left end, 0-0. How often in history has there been a 0-0 tie? Or according to what the rule book says, what we just talked about, is it even possible to have a 0-0 tie? What would be the shape of the histogram or the bar chart that we would use if we were defining the height of the bar over 0-0? It's probably 0 high. I think that's okay. We go all the way to the other end, 180-0. We can pretty much call that one 0 high too. And all of the meat of the curve of the bar chart or the histogram is going to be somewhere between 0 and 180. Now, what does your intuition tell you about the shape of a curve, the shape of a graph, if we were to do that for all of the possible scores? Well, that's a good question. So what are the possible scores? Is 1-0 a possible score? No, it's not. Is 2-0 a possible score? Yes, it is, because someone could get a safety. 3-0 is a possible score. Patricia has told us that already. So is 3-2 and 3-3 and 3-5 and 3-7. We can begin to fill out every single point on the number line before we estimate the frequencies of each of these points. But I think our intuition tells us something about the shape of this curve. Does anyone have a guess about what they think the shape of this curve is that describes the frequency of possible outcomes? Does anybody think it might be a bell curve? Probably a bell curve. Now, let's be a little bit more precise about what we think about the bell curve. Normally, bell curves are tallest in the middle. The middle of our range is 90. Yes, it's a skewed bell curve. Tim is correct. I think that's correct. I think most of the scores above 70-0 are probably very, very unlikely. So the height of the bell curve on that right side is going to be very, very, very flat, very close to the axis. And most of the bell curve is going to be on the left side of the chart, probably tallest in the 20s or 30s. So between 0 and maybe 60 points, that's probably where the meat of the bell curve is going to be. But our intuition has told us that because we know something about football, because we have experience with football, because maybe we watched football or even gone to a football game. Intuitions and judgment are an excellent thing. Sometimes they can get us into trouble. So let's take a look at when. Let's play a very simple war game as an exercise in deciding whether or not we have any intuition, and again illustrating the 3Q. Now, I'm going to illustrate the 3Q several times tonight, and you might think it's getting repetitive, but I think that every time you do, you're going to be delighted by what happens when we apply the 3Q to this situation. Now, what I want to do is divide the class in half. If your birthday is even, we're going to call you the even half of the class. If your birthday is odd, we're going to call you the odd class of the half. I was born on the first day of the month, so I will be in the odd half of the class, which is probably appropriate. All right. So the even is going to do one thing and the odd is going to do another thing. The game that I'm going to introduce on the next slide is known as the tactical arrival problem. It is a very simple war game that actually simulates the tactics of combat aircraft flying an approach to an airport in unfriendly territory. It is also very similar to a game known as matching pennies that's used in introductory texts on game theory. Here is a picture of the tactical arrival problem. It numbers the sectors around an airfield just as if they were cut into the slices of a pizza. In the left-hand side of the graphic, you can see that pizza overlaid on an airfield near Kuwait, just like it would be for aircrew conducting operations into and out of this airfield during Operation Iraqi Freedom or during Desert Storm. Now, the way to play this game is for the even team to pretend that they're the pilot of this combat aircraft, and for the odd team to pretend that they're the adversary. The adversary is going to establish him or herself in one of these sectors and attempt to fire a shoulder-launched surface-to-air missile at any aircraft that enters that sector. Because of the limitations of the weapon, you can only engage an aircraft if the aircraft is in that sector. So the even team will pick a number between 1 and 8. The odd team will pick a number between 1 and 8, and then simultaneously we will each reveal our numbers. So for the sake of this game, Nick, I'm going to let you be the aircraft. I'm going to be the adversary. And on the count of 3, Nick, if you'll type your number into the chat, I will announce my number out loud. All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. My number's 2. I don't see Nick. Nick, did you? All right, he said 3. I'll assume that that's just a lag of the computer and not that he was spying on what sector that I was in. Now, if we play this game over and over and over again, what happens? So Nick said he was in the odd group, so I kind of put him on the spot by making him an aircraft pilot. what was the outcome of the first iteration of this game? The outcome was that the aircraft safely arrived because the aircraft conducted its approach in a sector that the adversary was not there. Now, I can tell you from my time in the Air Force that this is actually one of the tactics employed. It's not classified because it's so elementary. But like I said, the qualitative outcome was that the aircraft arrived safely. How do we quantify this outcome? In football, we were talking wins and losses. I think we would give the win to the aircraft pilot because normally we look at these things in terms of blue, unless you're on the red team all the time. How do we quantify the outcome of this game? Does anybody have a suggestion? The distance between sectors is one way to quantify this. That's an excellent comment. One way I think to quantify this simply is to count how many times you achieve success or how many times you win the game. So we could just say 1 to 0. The aircraft has 1, the adversary has 0. That way, if we play it again, now we can just tabulate the number of wins that each player has. If we were to do that, then we would probably move to step 2, estimate the range of possible outcomes. Now, we just said that there's 2 different ways to quantify the outcome of this game, either as a 1 or a 0, denoting win or loss, or by distance between sectors. If we did distance between sectors, what's the farthest away that an aircraft could be from another sector? Well, one example would be 8 and 4. Those 2 sectors are on opposite sides of the circle. You could subtract 8 and 4. That's not exactly a true mathematical representation of the distance. I could tell you that normally these sectors are approximately 25 miles in radius. And we can use that number to figure out the distance between sectors. But whatever it is we decide, we can then move to step 2, to find the range of possible outcomes. So let's just use wins and losses. Let's say that we played the game 20 times to train the pilots and to see what the behavior of the adversary was. We've already defined the outcome qualitatively. He was either safe or he wasn't. We've defined the outcome quantitatively. A 1 means the pilot was safe, and a 0 means that the pilot was not safe. So in 20 iterations of this game, on the left-hand side, just like the football game, we have theoretically, essentially, well, let's just say 0, 0. 0 is a good place to anchor any number line. It's impossible to get 0, 0 because we've played the game 20 times. On the far right-hand side, if the pilot arrives safely 20 times, then it's 20 to 0. Now we can begin to populate the things in the middle. If half of the time the pilot got shot down and half of the time the aircraft arrived safely, the score would be 10-10. That's approximately in the middle. So we've described the range of possible outcomes. Every combination of scores possible between 0 and 20. Now, what are the frequency of possible outcomes? Well, that's a good question too. How likely is it that the adversary is going to shoot down the bad guy? And I hope that this pizza is simple and you can easily see that only 1/8 of the time will the pilot get shot down. And so we could then take our knowledge of this probability and create a histogram that is numerically accurate. I actually don't have much intuition for what this histogram would be, except that I think it would be a mirror image of itself. 20 to 0 is highly unlikely because at least 1/8 of the time the pilot's going to get shot down. 0 to 20, which is what the adversary's most extreme score would be, is also highly unlikely. But the probability of 0 to 20 is the same as the probability of 20 to 0. The probability of 10 to 10 is probably something near the median, and the probabilities that the enemy has a certain number of hits is equal to the probability that the pilot arrived safely a bunch of times, and we could chart this if we want to. But this very simple game, this pizza pie overlaid on an airfield begins to give us histograms that kind of we don't have any intuition about. And I think that's really important and a really important point to make. All right. One of the things that you could do with a simple game like this, and one of the reasons why it actually is fairly accurate, is that force protection, security forces, the Army will sanitize a radius a certain distance away from the airfield. Airplanes are higher when they're farther away from the airfield and have to be lower as they approach the center of the airfield. So there's a lot of things that could go into a model that describes this mathematically, but the simple pizza pie chart actually represents the situation very well. 1/8 of the time, we expect the pilot to get shot down. 50% of the time, we expect the shooter and the aircraft to be on the same side of the airfield. So if we wanted to do some more detailed analysis, we could figure out some other kinds of things. We could draw some more inferences from our knowledge about the frequency of possible outcomes. All right, that's the tactical arrival problem. So let's move on to rolling dice. Now, you can see pictured there a histogram with some dice on it. I'm going to ask you to get out a piece of paper, a scrap paper, a legal pad, some printer paper, or something, because I want the even people in the class to write down their thoughts before saying them, and I want the odd people in the class, the odd numbered people in the class, to try and do things in their head. I think each of us will probably end up with slightly different answers, and I think it will illustrate the importance of this checklist. So we are going to imagine that we have a single dice. You have your imaginary dice in your hand. I have mine. Now, if I roll the dice, what is the outcome of a single roll of the dice? Can you describe it qualitatively? It's probably a little bit more difficult to describe this particular experiment qualitatively than it is quantitatively. Can you describe it qualitatively? Does anybody want to try to describe it qualitatively? Anyone at all? Our natural tendency is to immediately give an example of what number was on the top part of the dice when we saw it. But what I just said was a qualitative description and not a quantitative description. Quantitative description would be, oh, I have the number 3, for example, or hey, I have a number 1, or I have a number 6. Those are ways to quantitatively encode the qualitative outcome of the dice. Now, that's the qualitative and the quantitative outcome of the dice. What is the range of possible outcomes? Anyone? We're only using one dice. So if someone answered 2 to 12, 1 to 6, whole numbers. All right, excellent. Yes, that is the range of possible outcomes. Now, what is the frequency of possible outcomes? If I were to draw a histogram similar to the one that's depicted on the screen, the histogram would only have one dice representing the bar. Like you could draw a single dot inside a square and give it a certain height for your histogram, just like I've done here. In the case of the single dice, every bar is going to be the same height. The probability of getting a 1 is 1/6. So the probability of getting a 2 is the same all the way up through 6. So the heights of these bars are all going to be same, and that's exactly what we'd expect in the one dice game. All right, you guys are now experts in, number 1, being able to recite the 3Q. So let's turn up the stakes just a little bit. Now, imagine that you have 2 dice. We are going to make a histogram, much like the one that appears on screen. It's an incomplete histogram, and that's on purpose, because I didn't want to show you all the answers. But imagine that you have 2 dice in your hand, and you roll the dice at the same time. All right. Someone tell me what they got when they rolled their 2 dice. Anybody want to tell me what they got? scroll here. Somebody got a 4 and a 2. All right. You have described the outcome of your dice, and you basically described it quantitatively. You could have used words and not numbers to tell me what you saw, and that would have described it, and that would have been describing it qualitatively. But in this case, in this scenario, it's easier to describe it quantitatively. All right. Excellent job. So we got a 4 and a 2. What we are going to do is add up the numbers we see on the dice and report that. Okay? So you're going to roll 2 dice, and Mary, you would have said 6. Patricia, you would have said 6 as well because you got a 3 and a 3. Walker, you would have said 12 because you had a 6 and a 6. All right. We've described the outcome of a toss of 2 dice qualitatively and quantitatively. Remember, we're applying the rule that we have to sum up the dice. All right. What is the range of possible outcomes? If you're even number, I want you to write down your answer. If you're not, if you're an odd number, just say it out loud to yourself, and maybe one of you put it in the chat. What is the range of possible outcomes? Two to 12. Excellent. All right. How many? So we've described the range of possible outcomes, and we're going to move to describing the frequency of possible outcomes. The chart that's on the screen is going to help you a little bit. How many ways can we get the sum 2? The chart on the screen shows that there's only one way. Does anybody disagree? What if one of the dice was red and one of the dice was white? Now, that's kind of a twist that I threw at you. I'm kind of changing the rules as the game goes on, but this is an important distinction because in game theory, we would talk about sampling with replacement or without replacement. The algorithm of a computer might actually have that nuanced difference in it, but it forces us to explain our assumptions. We're going to assume that both dice are the same color and that there's only one way to get a 2, a 1 and a 1. How many ways is there to get a 3? That's also depicted on the screen. There's only one way. How many ways is there to get a 4? That's also depicted on the screen. You can throw a 1 and a 3 to get 4, or you can throw a 2 and a 2. Similarly, with 5, and so there's only 2 ways to get it: 1 and 4, 2 and 3. As long as we're not doing it, as long as we're using the same colored dice. If you could see here now, if it was different colored dice, there's still only one way to get 2. The red dice is always going to be 1, and the white dice is always going to be 2. But when I get to numbers like 5 and 6, now those bars on the chart are going to be taller if the dice are different color. They're going to be twice as tall if the dice are different color. So it forces us to state our assumptions. 6, I didn't fill out the chart completely for you on 6, but you could do 1 and 5, 2 and 4, 3 and 3. And again, if it were 2 colored dice, it would be twice as high. 7 happens to be the same height as 6. 1 and 6, 2 and 5, 3 and 4. And if we continued building the chart out, it would be symmetric on the right side to what it was on the left side. It would basically look like a bell curve, a discrete bell curve. This histogram would represent the discrete bell curve. All right, everybody think they've mastered all of the intuition of playing dice? All right, for the next iteration of this game, imagine that you have 2 dice in your hand. Imagine that they're the same color. Now we've stated some of our assumptions. This time we're going to roll the dice, and we're going to take the product of the 2 numbers that are on the screen. All right, as soon as I ask the next question, I want somebody in the odd group to blurt out their answer by typing it into the chat. If you're part of the even group, write your answer down on a piece of paper before you read the chat. All right. What are the possible, we know how to express the outcomes of tosses of the die. We already know how to do that. So I'm going to skip to step 2, the range of possible outcomes. What are the range of possible outcomes for the product of 2 dice? Go. Somebody tell me your answer. 1 to 36. Excellent. Tim got it. All right. When we added up the dice, the range started at 2. When we multiply the dice, the range starts at 1. Sometimes I can trick people into saying 2 to 36. Or conversely, sometimes when we're talking about adding the dice, sometimes people will mistakenly blurt out 1 to 12. In either case, it's a simple example, but it shows you that sometimes your intuition will make you blurt out something that's just slightly wrong. All right, so 1 to 36. Now we are going to create on a piece of scrapbook paper a histogram that represents the frequency of possible outcomes. Do you think it will look like a bell curve like it did with the sun? Anybody have any guesses about the shape of this histogram that we're going to make? Anybody at all? All right, well, let's think about it. How many ways are there to get 1? 1 equals 1 times 1. There's only one way. How many ways are there to get 2? 2 is 1 times 2. There's only one way. How many ways are there to get 3? 3. 1 times 3. There's only one way. Right now, the bell curve is starting out really flat for the first 3. And maybe that wasn't exactly in our intuition. The minute we started saying it out loud, it makes sense. 4 is either 1 times 4 or 2 times 2. Do you think you can see the pattern? Do you think you can see the pattern all the way to the middle of this curve? Do you think you can see the pattern all the way to the end? Anybody have any guesses yet? Is anybody's intuition? Sorry, let me go back. 5. Let's do 5. How many ways can you get 5? Someone in the chat, tell me how many ways you can get 5. I'm sorry. 1 times 5. There's only one way to get 5. So our histogram started out very short with a height of 1. It started to climb when we got to 4. There's 2 ways to get 4. And then when we got to 5, it went back down to 1. So this one clearly doesn't follow our intuition. Let's do 6, since our intuition has already lied to us once. 6 is 1 times 6 or 2 times 3. There's only 2 ways to do 6. Do we think we've got the rest of the curve figured out? What happens next? When we get to 7, we're stumped. There is no way to get 7. Does anybody know the mathematical word that we would use to describe what 7 is? I know you weren't expecting to do math tonight, certainly not in public. 7 is known as a prime number. 5 is also a prime number. 3 is also a prime number, but 7 is a prime number. It has no factors other than 7 in itself. So we can't get 7, so there's a gap in the histogram at 7. All right, let's keep going. 8. I can't do 1 times 8. That's no longer part of my repertoire. 2 times 4 is a possibility. 3 is not going to work. 4 times 2 is the same thing as 2 times 4. 5 is not going to work. 6 is not going to work. So there's only one way to get 8. I can continue. And as I continue working my way up to 36, several things are going to happen, all of which defeat my intuition. For example, 21. How do I get 21? Can anybody figure out how to get 21 as the sum or as the product of 2 dice? It's impossible because 21 is 3 times 7 and there is no 7. So in addition to the prime numbers greater than 6, there are several gaps in our chart wherever there's a prime number. There's also several gaps in our chart whenever a product has a prime number as one of its factors and that prime number is greater than 6. So there's several holes all throughout this chart, and this chart completely destroys our intuition. Now, everybody knows that you use dice in war games. Sometimes you just read the number off the dice. Sometimes you add the dice up. Maybe sometimes you even multiply the dice for their product. But do these simple mathematical operations that we're doing with these imaginary dice match anything in the real world? The answer is that yes, they do. Error propagation For example, if I'm the captain of a battleship and I tell a sailor to steer a heading of 090, I want to go to the east, he's probably not going to steer directly east. He will steer slightly left of east sometimes and slightly right of east sometimes. And how often he's not exactly steering east is subject to lots of things like the wind and the waves and his distractions and all of those kinds of things. And those natural phenomena cause error to propagate. And that error propagation actually follows the same patterns as the sum of dice or the product of dice, depending on what the situation is. There's another thing that I think you guys probably could have come up with on your own, but it's decision trees with some chance. Sometimes, for example, if I'm the captain of that battleship and I have somebody in the radar room searching for enemy aircraft, there is a way to use probabilities, chance, and the toss of the dice to model the kinds of things that happen in the natural world, even though they aren't probabilistic. And the decisions I make based on the information I get from intel, for example, can be modeled using the same patterns with the sums and the products of these dice. So even though this was just a simple game with dice, it is in fact representative of the real world and of the complex patterns that emerge when we do three simple steps. When we follow these 3Q, when we do these three simple steps, complex patterns emerge, number one. Number two, they force us to write down our assumptions, whether we're using different colored dice. They sometimes force us to pause so that we don't blurt out something mistaken, and so on and so forth. All right. That's the 3Q with rolling dice. Now, one of the things I will tell you is after we're done here, I would be happy. I have a 60-page paper, actually, that explains the rolling dice and the 3Q in greater detail. If you want a copy of that paper, I would be happy to provide it to the teachers of the class for dissemination. Or if you wanted to reach out to your teacher and they could put you in contact with me, I would share that with you as well. Let's move to the more complex war games. I hope you recognize the beautiful illustration here on the game. Before we get to the game that's pictured here, I want us to play a little bit of tic-tac-toe. And for this, again, I recommend that you have a piece of scrap paper because I guarantee that you won't be able to play this game in your head. I want you to draw a tic-tac-toe board that fills up the entire paper. The vertical lines are as tall as the paper and the horizontal lines are as wide as the paper. I want each square on this tic-tac-toe game to be really, really big. So I'll give you a second to draw your tic-tac-toe game. Now, in the top left corner of my tic-tac-toe game, I'm going to draw a smaller tic-tac-toe game. And then in the top center, I'm going to draw a smaller tic-tac-toe game. And then in the top right, I'm going to draw another tic-tac-toe game. And I'm going to draw 9 small tic-tac-toe games. I call this Inception Tic-Tac-Toe, kind of after the movie. Now, we could play this game 2 ways. One of the ways we could play this is a little bit hard to do in a webinar, but I will explain it because the dynamics of the game are fascinating. So in one set of rules, you play the game with the referee. The even players would have their scrap paper with their tic-tac-toe, and the odd players would have their scrap paper with their tic-tac-toe. And we'll let the even players go first, and they're going to put an X in one of those small tic-tac-toe games, and they're going to go show the referee. The referee is going to mark down where that X is on the master game. And then the odd players will have a chance to play. They are not allowed to see where the X was placed until after they place their O. Now, if the odd player places his O in a square that is already occupied, he loses his turn. But in each subsequent turn of the play, the person making the play is not allowed to see the playing board until they make their play. Now, you can certainly copy down what you saw onto your own notepad so that you have an accurate assessment of the order of battle, as it were. But you won't know the most recent move until after you make your play. That one's kind of difficult to do on the webinar, so we're just going to play a simpler game. In this game, I'm going to start by placing an X somewhere on one of these 9 small boards. What I'm going to do is go to the bottom right-hand corner and place an X in the middle of that little small tic-tac-toe game. Now, the next player must put their O in a different tic-tac-toe game determined by where I put my X. Since I put my X smack dab in the middle, the next play must be made in the big middle square. And you can play wherever you want in the big middle square. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that O puts theirs in the top left of the small game that's being played here in the center of our big tic-tac-toe grid. I'm going to number these grids 1, 2, 3 across the top, 4, 5, 6 across the middle, 7, 8, 9 across the bottom. So I started by playing mine in the center of grid 9. O's played in the top left corner of grid 5. Because O played in the top left corner, now the next move has to be played in grid 1. I can place my X anywhere in grid 1. Now, what I want you to do is play against yourself for a couple moves. Go ahead and start playing against yourself and start thinking, how am I going to win this game? What kinds of pitfalls will I encounter along the way? Is there anything I haven't thought of? There almost certainly is. So I want you to go ahead and play yourself for a couple of rounds. I'm going to play myself for a couple of rounds. I'll do so silently so I don't interrupt your train of thought, but that'll give me an idea of, approximately how long it's taking you to play. All right, I'm several moves in, and O's won the match in grid 5. But as I stated, one of the advantages of the 3 Qs, they force us to write down our questions and our assumptions and the rules of the game. Did we win the game? Did I win the game? Did O's win the game by getting 3 in a row in grid 5? No. If I had completely defined the game appropriately to you, I would have said that the game is won when there are 3 in a row in the big grid and not just in the small grid. So you've got to, it's kind of like you're a platoon inside in grid 5, you're a platoon trying to hold that piece of ground, but you need the whole company to hold all of the ground to get 3 in a row. Are there any other pitfalls that occur while you're playing this game? What strategy did you adopt to play these games? Now, these are all the kinds of questions we would ask anytime we encountered a war game. But I also think that applying the 3Q to the situation would help you to methodically work your way through and answer some of the questions without playing all the variations of the game. One of the things that can happen is you can end up, over the course of the game, going back to a grid that is already stalemated, that is already completely filled out, or that is already won. What do you do if you're sent back to a grid that you can't make a move in? Well, again, if we clearly specify the rules at the outset, maybe we would have realized that we needed to do that. But as in games, In war, we encounter situations that we did not clearly specify at the outset. One of the things that this illustrates is that sometimes applying the 3Q is extremely difficult at the outset. The first time perhaps you played something like a cyber war game instead of a traditional war game with combat ground forces, maybe the outcomes were something that you couldn't quite wrap your mind around, you didn't have an intuition about. And so if you had tried to apply the 3Q at an outset of an unfamiliar war game, maybe you would not have been able to. But as you play war games, you should take the outcome of each iteration of play and put it on that mental histogram. You should do as much thinking ahead of time to kind of describe the landscape of that histogram, to describe the range of possible outcomes and the frequency of possible outcomes. You should play the war game and keep track of the outcomes that you actually encounter. And you should do some analysis after the fact. Now, for this whole hour, I've been talking about the outcomes of particular war games, but you can actually apply this tool, the 3Q, to things that go on inside the war game. Maybe it's individual matchups of two combat units that's taking place in a larger campaign inside a war game. Maybe it's other quantitative things that you can measure in the war game, like distance between a shooter and an aircraft, or the combat strength of a unit that's on the ground, or the number of moves made, the number of days that transpire in the war game, the amount of time that it actually takes to play a particular move in a complicated war game like Littoral Commander or something like that. You can describe things like the strength of a unit. How does the game Littoral Commander describe the strength of a unit inside the rules of that particular war game? So I've said communicating uncertainty in the outcomes of war games, but you can communicate uncertainty in many characteristics of the war game as well. I have played this particular tic-tac-toe game all the way to an end at least one time, and it encountered several other unique characteristics of the game that I don't actually remember off the top of my head. And at the time, we were playing on a whiteboard in my office, and so we didn't make good notes of what happened. But we should have. We should have made good notes of what happened, because every additional step in such a tic-tac-toe game revealed something to us about the game that we had not anticipated ahead of time. All right, Littoral Commander. Here's your chance now. I'm not going to do a step-by-step analysis of the 3Q and apply it to a Littoral Commander, the outcome of a game, because it's a very lengthy game. But what I will do is illustrate what I was just talking about, some of the characteristics of the game. So if you have played Littoral Commander, and I hope you have, or else Sebastian is falling short, do you recall how many different core actions a player may make in a game? You are blue in a game. There is N number of things that you can accomplish on each turn. Anybody remember what those are? 4. Nick is correct. You can, number 1, move and or initiate combat. You can move and or conceal. You can move and or resupply, or you can play a joint capability card. So we've counted the number of outcomes of a particular move just by looking at the instructions. We could apply that. I could pull a card out of the blue deck and tell you what I see on the card and talk about the strength of a unit, talk about the firepower of a unit, talk about the maneuverability of the unit. And each of those things we could describe both qualitatively and quantitatively. And sometimes we can combine them. So what do you think is more maneuverable? A unit of infantry or mobile unit, mobile infantry? Well, the answer is obvious. Somebody with vehicles is going to be more maneuverable. That's a qualitative comparison between two elements of the game. But the game is actually going to define what we mean by more mobile quantitatively. Sometimes we'll have those numbers and be able to say, hey, the mobile unit can go 10 units in a single play, and the infantry unit can only go 2 units in a single play. So the mobile unit is 5 times more maneuverable than the infantry unit, and sometimes we will only be able to do that qualitatively. But we should insist on doing both. Here's an example where that pattern we saw on the dice is going to come into play. If our strategy was to move our unit as far as we could across the board to try to get to particular terrain or something like that, we're looking at the sums of dice. And then when we engage in combat or something like that, it's going to look a lot more like the pattern of the product of dice. And in this case, the dice have approximately 20 sides of them. So we can look at individual characteristics of a complex game, apply the 3Q. It will force us to write down our assumptions, force us to write down the rules that we understand about the game, force us to write down the things that we discover about the game that we did not have an intuition for, and force us to be disciplined in our thought process to how we analyze the game. Those are all very important things. It's really fun to give this talk in a group of people and hear everybody chuckle the first time somebody says the product of dice ranges from 2 to 36 because they leapt in their intuition from sums to products. Or to discover for the first time that there's a gap at 5 or 7 or 21 or things like that. And it drives home the point of how important it is to have a methodical way to think through these things. All right, I'm going to move on to a section that I call other considerations. There are many other considerations, and one of the things that I'm going to do is something that I encourage you to do as much as possible. As you embark on your professional careers, whenever you come up with a proposal, whenever you come up with a recommended course of action, whenever you're trying to give advice or influence someone to go a certain direction or make a certain decision, I recommend that you always consider the weakness of the recommendation that you're going to make. And so I'm going to consider what are the weaknesses of the 3Q model. Do any of you have any thoughts about what some of the weaknesses of the 3Q model are? Have any of you observed some of the weaknesses of the 3Q model over the course of the last hour? Anyone? Roll. You can't see outside the box. Yes and no. I think our imaginations can see outside the box. As long as we let our imagination see outside the box. Our intuitions, on the other hand, might be limited to inside the box or might lie to us, might lead us down a blind alley of that maze. I certainly think that's a legitimate claim to make about the 3Q model. There are some things that we've encountered in war over the ages that no one could have anticipated. There are some things, perhaps, that we could have anticipated. In the lead up to Desert Storm, perhaps we could have played several iterations of those tactical war games and asked, what was the range of possible outcomes? Is it ever possible that 2 units engage and that there's no casualties? I think one of the strengths of the 3Q is that it forces us to ask questions. Perhaps you've heard someone say before, it's a little bit cliche that sometimes asking questions is better than actually getting the answers. I think the 3Q will help us do that. One of the weaknesses that I often encounter is that sometimes it's really hard to either quantify a thing or it's really hard to qualify a thing. I think the tactical arrival problem was a good example of that. It was very easy to describe in qualitative terms what the outcome of that game was. It was a little bit more difficult to quantify the thing, especially given the limitations of the game. Distance, maybe distance could work. And that would be one way to quantify the game. We didn't have any concrete distances in the way that I presented the game. We didn't have any actual concrete distances that I could use. And I'm not even sure we could subtract the numbers that were used to label the pieces of pie, because I could have just labeled them A through G, and then you would not have been able to subtract them to get any kind of quantitative measure. And oh, by the way, 8 was right next to 1. Which doesn't make any sense. It makes sense that 3 is between 2 and 4, but the fact that 8 is next to 1 makes sense when we see the picture, but it doesn't really make sense in a quantitative sense. So sometimes it's hard to quantify, whether that's describing the outcome quantitatively, or describing the range of possible outcomes quantitatively, or describing the frequency. I sat in on a war game up at the Pentagon one year. It was in the Indo-Pacific, and we played the game for several days. We didn't play it to a win or a loss. The war game was designed to train people and expose people to war games, and not really to make a decision or produce data for making a decision. So we didn't play it to a win or a loss. So it was very difficult to quantify the outcome of the war game. We couldn't say, hey, this person won or that person lost. It's also difficult to quantify sometimes at the strategic level. Did we win Operation Iraqi Freedom? I don't know. I certainly think we had established a military victory in the first month or so of that operation. But there were some strategic objectives that it's really hard to describe whether or not we actually won or lost. And that, depending on what year of the calendar you look at that nation, it's also difficult to answer. So at the strategic level, it may be extremely difficult to both quantify and qualify. That's some weaknesses. However, I believe that you can always count something. We played the game one time, there I counted it. We played the games 2 times, there I counted. You can always count something. In the tactical arrival problem, I counted how many times the pilot made it safely to the airfield. So by counting something, you can always quantify something. It may be difficult to determine if there was a win or a loss. You can probably count things like time, money, people, airplanes, tanks, bullets. There's lots of things that you can count. And counting those things will start to paint a picture in your own mind in a quantitative sense. Counting those things will give shared numbers that people can talk about. Just like when we talked about football, if we go all the way back to the beginning of the hour, we said the Kansas City Chiefs won, and then we said it was a close game, 27-20. We put numbers on a thing, and those numbers told us something about the team. If I said we won the battle, and I said it was one platoon against one platoon, that would give you a different sense of what happened than if I said we won the battle. It was Desert Storm-like, and it was 300,000 troops and this many tanks and this many airplanes, and we had this many casualties and this many POWs. We can always count things, and those things help us understand what went on, just like they did in the football game. That's one of the weaknesses of the game. Our intuition is probably one of the weaknesses. Sometimes taking the time to actually rigorously make that histogram is going to take a long, long time, even with the product of dice. To do all 36 would probably take us 10 or 15 minutes if we do it. If we drew all of those dice on the chart like I asked us to play the tic-tac-toe inception game one time to an end, it's going to take a few minutes. To play it 2 times to an end, it's going to take a few minutes. So sometimes it's time-consuming to apply the 3Q. But sometimes it's necessary because it exposes those weaknesses in our intuition. I think at the end of the day, the 3Q is not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea. What it is a simple tool, easy to explain to anyone. You could explain this to a GO. You could explain this to a political appointee leading a nation. You could explain this to somebody who's playing a war game for their first time. It's easy to explain the rules. It's a little bit more difficult to apply the rules rigorously over and over again. There are some pitfalls that we fall into, but by explaining the rules, we set a shared baseline for communicating about the game. We start to build intuition. We start to build judgment based on a shared set of metrics, for lack of a better term. We are establishing a shared language to communicate about the outcomes of the game, and shared language to ask questions about the outcome of the game. I think if you apply these 3Q to your war games, it will help you to begin to anticipate some of the questions people may have about the outcomes of war games. and think through how the data used in these war games is going to be applied to the decisions that war games are often used to support. So that's one of the considerations of this war game. Another consideration is that we get into the habit of adding tools to our tool chests, and rarely do we ever take any out. I like to think of gardening sometimes, and I recommend that everybody think about what pruning means. Sometimes we have to cut away a healthy branch of a tree just so that an even more healthy branch of a tree grows better, stronger, and brings forth more fruit. I'm hesitant to add another tool to your toolbox, but unfortunately I am, and that's one of the things that we ought to consider. All right, that wraps up my presentation. Let me go ahead and scroll to the next slide. Remind you again that these opinions were mine and do not reflect the official position of the Air Force Special Operations Command, the U.S. Air Force Reserve, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. And then I will also share there my bio and a picture of part of my family, because when I un-DOD'd my slides and used this canned template that I found, it made cropping some of the pictures difficult. So I will open it up to questions at this time. I am watching the chat. And
Yes,
Nick, if you
please. So if people have questions, they can type them down here in the chat, and I'll read them out so that they can be saved for the YouTube posterity. Let's see. Okay. Not seeing any yet. So I'm curious, can you give an example of how you've applied this in your own work to the degree that you can discuss it with the Air Force?
yeah,
You've given some very simple examples and some commercial examples. You mind speaking to your professional experience?
certainly. I will tell you a war game that we played, although I can't give you all the details on it. So one of the technologies, one of the ways that we use war games in our office is to begin to evaluate some of the emerging technologies. Everybody wants a new piece of equipment. The special tactics guys want, new rifles that shoot farther with higher power scopes and that kinds of things. The Air Force guys want new, electronic warfare equipment and those kinds of things. And one of the ways we use war games is to evaluate these emerging technologies. We actually use the tactical arrival problem to evaluate some of these technologies. I've dropped a Word document in the chat. You can download that and use it if you will. I think it explains a little bit of how we use it. But let's say that we were getting ready to fly into an airfield, and we want to evaluate the effectiveness of a small UAV in collecting ISR to contribute to air-based defense. We want the Army guys on the ground or the security forces guys on the ground to be able to use these small aircraft to detect whether or not there's an adversary in a particular sector as an aircraft is beginning to arrive. There's a set of rules in that document that explains how to do that, and I can explain it briefly. So in this case, the adversary selects the number 1 through 8, picks which sector of the airfield that they are going to be in, and they reveal that to the referee. Simultaneously, the friendlies pick which sector of the airfield they are going to deploy their UAV into and share that with the referee. If the UAV is in the same sector as the adversary, then the referee will tell the pilot, hey, there is an adversary in this sector, and the pilot can select another sector to fly his approach into. This is a very simple example of how we kind of evaluate this emerging capability. One of the first times that I played this game with some of the members of our office, I was surprised to find that the friendlies didn't use the technology. They just picked the sector anyways. They didn't ask the referee for any information about the intel gathered. That was an outcome that I did not expect using the technology. This is just a very simple example. I'll give you another example. One of the emerging technologies that I'm sure you're aware of is known as rocket cargo. SpaceX is developing all kinds of capabilities to conduct space lift. the military has announced broadly in unclassified forums that they are considering using all forms of spacecraft, of rocket ships, of pre-positioned cargo in orbit and those kinds of things to deliver cargo around the globe. And so we were tasked to figure out if using spacelift would work in a very specific situation, a contingency plan that we support inside of AppSoc. And so we played that game several times and conducted our own 3Q analysis to make sure that we could try to at least expose some of the biases that we might have by playing the game and those kinds of things. We did apply in that situation. I don't know that, unfortunately, I can't really talk about the findings in that game. We didn't like rocket cargo, that's what I'll say. We didn't think it was very helpful. I'll actually will. I'll give you some of the findings. In this case, we took the 3Q and applied it to specific elements of the game. All right, so let's talk about launching a rocket from a pad. If I am the President of the United States or the Secretary of Defense, am I going to launch a rocket from a pad towards my troops who are, let's say, pick an island somewhere in the Pacific? Am I going to launch a rocket to deliver cargo to my troops in an island in the Pacific? There are several possible outcomes to that decision. One of them is that the nation, the adversary nation, might see that as an escalatory event. That nation might know that it's a cargo rocket because their intel is pretty good, but they might use it as an opportunity to exploit strategic ambiguity and escalate the situation anyways and accuse us, the United States, of doing something to escalate the situation. You know, we could be accused of launching a nuclear weapon, a rocket coming out of the United States and headed toward the Pacific. It's easy to imagine how state actors could amplify and twist that information. And so that was one of the ways that we looked at outcomes of elements of the game to kind of expand the box that we were thinking through, to Patricia's comment about seeing outside the box.
Thank you for that.
Question here. Yep.
So
question in the chat. I'll go ahead.
So just so people can have this in the recording later, have you seen an example of where wargaming has driven or informed quantitative modeling? If so, how was the game used?
Yes, quite often I have seen how war games have driven or informed quantitative modeling. I will give you one practical example and then a little bit of theoretical background, but I think I'll do it in the reverse order. There was a really good article, and I think the author's name was Hanley, and it was in a Naval War College journal. And one of the things that he did was he did some mathematical computations that are very simple to follow in the way that he wrote them. And he described a computer that would be necessary to accurately model all of the interactions in a war game between 10 red players and 10 blue players. This is all of the interactions can be formally described as combinatorics. Again, that's a big mathematical word. It's not really that important. If you were to draw a line from blue player 1 to every element of the game, red player 1, red player 2, red player 3, and on through red player 10, and also blue player 1 to blue player 2, blue player 1 to blue player 3, and so on and so forth, and then count up all of the lines that you draw, this particular author uses a war game to count out how many computations would be necessary to perfectly model all of the interactions in this game. The surprising result is that the computer would have to do more computations than there are atoms in the entire universe. It's a mind-boggling astronomical number. He did this in part to argue that physics-based war games are not always necessarily the right way to do things. I think it's pretty easy to see this if I give you a practical example. Let's just say that I have one bad guy and one good guy. Both of them have a rifle, and they start out, I don't know, a mile away from each other. Do I need to code into the computer the physics of walking across the field? Do I need to code into the computer the ballistics, the way gravity has an effect on the bullet? No, probably not, because I can come up with a very accurate representation of what happens in that one-on-one match without doing all of the physics-based modeling. Now, on the other hand, nowadays, many people are asking for physics-based modeling in things like the electromagnetic spectrum or resilient communications, or even in things like computing the lag in time in between a remote pilot operator on one side of the world and how much time it takes his flight control inputs to get to an airplane on the other side of the world. Sometimes physics is appropriate for those things, but that's one example where Wargame-driven quantitative modeling and actually revealed something surprising to us. I'll give you another example, and this one's kind of cheating. I played a war game at while I was at the Pentagon, where we used a certain number of B-21s in a combat scenario, and we saw what the outcome of the game was. And then General Goldfein went up to Capitol Hill about a month later and reported to Congress that we needed so many B-21s. The outcome of the war game informed how many B-21s we needed. That is a quantitative thing. One of the pieces of analysis that was done after the war game was to figure out how many air crews we needed to fly and the number of B-21s that we played in the war game. The war game did not simulate things like crew rest, or the hotels that the crew were staying in, or tents, or whatever it was. But those are all things that we needed to think about. And one of the things that we did was what I would call sensitivity analysis. We looked at what was the effect on the number of air crew if we increased the number of B-21s. And what we found out was like increasing the number of B-21s by 1 didn't have a significant effect on the air crews. But at some certain number that I can't remember because it was about 8 years ago by now, there was a nonlinearity where, because of the amount of time that a crew could fly a mission and needed crew rest, you actually ended up needing twice as many crews above some increment. So maybe the game predicted that we needed 20 B-21s, and when we added 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 B-21s, it was a linear increase in the number of crews. But when we got to 30 B-21s, we needed twice as many crews as we thought we would, because of that nonlinearity in the quantitative analysis that was done on how crews get crew rest. So yeah, there have been many examples, and those games are used to inform, programs of record like the B-21. Sometimes those games are used to inform concepts that we won't adopt, like rocket cargo. In this particular scenario that we examined, we decided not to adopt rocket cargo as a way of mobility of men and materiel, that particular concept. I think they're being used all over the place. Some of the situations that they're being used in would surprise our intuition once you get exposed to them. Thanks for that question, Matt.
Thanks. We will, if there's any last questions, we'll take them. Otherwise, just want to have everyone thank our speaker, and we'll put a pin in it. Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for coming and speaking to us. It was fascinating. Appreciate your response to those questions. Everyone, have a great day. And if you're looking for this, to catch the rest of this presentation, we will have a recording up soon. So